Well, the coffee has arrived and the ranking member has arrived, so we're ready to begin. The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair will be authorized to declare a recess at any time. The subcommittee convenes today to examine the enforcement of our immigration laws. Prior to Inauguration Day, the border was secure. The laws were being enforced. The border wall was nearing completion. The Remain in Mexico policy had slowed illegal immigration to a trickle, and court-ordered deportations were being enforced. Of course, all of that changed when the new administration took office and immediately canceled the border wall, ended the Remain in Mexico policy, and ordered ICE to stop enforcing deportation orders. Since then, we've seen more than 2 million illegal immigrants deliberately released into this country, a population the size of the entire state of Nebraska. Meanwhile, more than 1.5 million known gotaways have also entered illegally, an additional illegal population the size of Hawaii. Our previous hearings have documented the unfolding human tragedy of the border crisis. For Americans, it means classrooms flooded with non-English speaking students, hospitals overwhelmed with illegal immigrants demanding care, fentanyl poisoning our young people, catastrophic strains on the social safety net meant to help Americans in need, criminal cartels and their affiliated gangs introduced into our communities, working wages suppressed by a flood of cheap illegal labor. And now we observe the irony of officials in so-called sanctuary cities like New York and Chicago and sanctuary states like California warning that they cannot handle this influx. For the illegal immigrants, it means a harrowing ordeal, subjecting them to exploitation by the criminal cartels, including sex trafficking, drug trafficking, and labor trafficking, even of small children. Many arrive in physical distress, destitute, and deeply in debt to their human smugglers. Thousands never make it. They die horrific deaths along the way. Well, now we raise the question, why? Clearly, our immigration laws are not being enforced by this administration. That fact is self-evident when we compare this administration to the last one. The law specifically provides that any asylum claimant shall be detained while their claim is heard. This is now routinely ignored. The law specifically provides that parole is to be granted only on a case-by-case basis for urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit. This law is now being ignored, while parole is granted en masse to release many tens of thousands of immigrants illegally into our country. The law requires deportation orders to be enforced. Yet despite record numbers of illegal entries, we see the lowest rate of deportations in our history, with more than 1 million deportation orders simply ignored. Federal courts have ordered this administration to enforce the law, yet time and again the administration seems reluctant to do so. Without enforcement, there is no immigration law. Without immigration law, there are no borders, and without borders, we have no country. This crisis now reaches into every community and constitutes a clear and present danger to our national sovereignty, prosperity, and security. We Americans have always prided ourselves as being a nation of laws and not of men. And yet it appears that our immigration laws are now routinely ignored, altered, or perverted by the whims of individuals within this administration. It's important in the inquiry today that we separate out policy differences from actual violations of law. The founders anticipated that foolish people would sometimes occupy the offices of our government, and they left it to voters to correct maladministration at the ballot box. Lincoln put it this way: the voters are everything. If the voters get their backsides too close to the fire, they'll just have to sit on the blisters a while. Mayor Eric Adams of New York City seems to be a poster child for this phenomenon. The more troubling question arises if this unprecedented illegal migration results not from incompetence and folly, but rather from a deliberate and calculated violation and subversion of the laws of the land. We need to determine what laws have allowed this calamity to befall our nation. As a legislative branch of government, it's our duty to correct them. And we also need to determine what laws are being willfully violated by those commanded to faithfully execute them. And in that case, we need to identify who is responsible and what remedies are available within our system of checks and balances. With that, I am now pleased to recognize the ranking member for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, another week, another immigration hearing on the border. After using harmful rhetoric and fear-mongering that ending the Title 42 public health policy would result in a high number of migrants coming to the border, we have seen a month where border numbers are down over 70% from their peak. As Politico put it, it is, quote, the migrant crisis that still hasn't arrived. Unable to stoke media fears any further around the end of Title 42, it appears that my Republican colleagues have shifted their focus to the next attention-grabbing headline, laying the groundwork for the impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas. Despite this being our 5th immigration hearing in about 5 months, the majority is yet to call any witness from the current administration to testify before this committee. It is no surprise that my colleagues have shifted to discussing if Secretary Mayorkas should be impeached. After all, extreme MAGA Republican Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene said just last week, in exchange for voting for the debt limit deal, she wanted some, quote, sides and desserts. Her, quote, beautiful dessert was that, and this is a quote from her, somebody needs to be impeached, and she specifically singled out Secretary Mayorkas as the, quote, lowest hanging fruit. Of course, my colleagues jumped at the chance to cater to the extreme MAGA Republicans in their party, and before the vote on the debt ceiling had even occurred, they noticed this hearing. According to a report from CNN just a few weeks ago, the chairman of this committee, which would be tasked with launching impeachment proceedings, and GOP leadership have an understanding that the impeachment of Mayorkas is inevitable. According to the article, quote, it is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. Anyone who tuned into last April's Judiciary Committee hearing where Secretary Mayorkas testified as part of his oversight duties would not be at all surprised. Republicans on this committee made their intentions quite clear. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana stated that Secretary Mayorkas had committed, quote, impeachable offenses. He went on to say, quote, my advice to you is to begin your search for a different career very soon because there will be an election. And Mr. Biggs of Arizona stated, you should be impeached. Earlier this year, Mr. Biggs followed through on that statement and became the second Republican to file articles of impeachment against Secretary Mayorkas. That resolution is co-sponsored by multiple members of this committee, including Mr. Gates and Mr. Nels. Mr. Roy of Texas, who is not one of those co-sponsors, even has a 13-page memo from October of 2021 entitled Case for Impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas. Representative Ben Cline from Virginia, who serves on the full committee, told CNN that he has communicated to Chairman Jordan that, quote, we need to start the process as soon as possible. Lastly, when our chairman, Mr. Jordan, was asked in an interview in October of last year if the secretary should be impeached, he said, Mayorkas deserves it, and more recently said the committee thinks it is, quote, warranted. Now, of course, the idea of impeaching the secretary is ridiculous. You do not impeach a cabinet secretary over policy disagreements. The border is not, quote, open. No administration has ever had complete, quote, operational control of the border, detained every asylum seeker, or not used parole in some form. As the former chairman of the House Committee on Homeland Security, Chairman McCall of Texas said, well, we talk a lot about operational control, and that's having a better understanding of who's coming in and who's leaving and what that threat really is. We're never really going to get that. The Biden administration is continuing to try to clean up the mess left by the previous administration. They are putting forward real, workable solutions to manage migration and expand legal pathways. On top of the parole programs created by the Biden administration earlier this year, the administration announced the creation of additional legal pathways that are intended to relieve pressure at the border. Now, it's not all perfect. In fact, some of my colleagues would argue that some of the administration's policies are too heavy-handed. Recently, the administration put forward a regulation which limits asylum, something many people within our Democratic caucus are justifiably concerned about. Unfortunately, today's hearing appears to be the start of a sad new chapter for this committee. But certainly, I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today and the perspectives they bring on this issue, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair notes the presence of the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, and recognizes him for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it took just over 5 months, but the day that so many of my Republican colleagues have waited for has finally arrived. Today, Judiciary Republicans are laying the groundwork to impeach the Homeland Security Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas. To be clear, they do not allege wrongdoing or malfeasance of any kind. They are simply catering to the most extreme members of their caucus who have demanded impeachment of somebody, anybody, as the price of their support for the Speaker. And they have decided to make their first target Secretary Mayorkas. Why? Because they have policy disagreements. But no matter how much they may dislike him, that is not a basis for impeachment. The Republicans are so desperate to begin impeachment, however, that they are even jockeying for position on who gets to take the lead. Today's hearing, just like the first immigration hearing we held, appears to be the latest spat in the ongoing turf war between Chairman Jordan and Chairman Green of the Homeland Security Committee. Just a couple of weeks ago, Homeland Security noted that they are taking a lead role in building the case for impeachment through a, quote, five-phase accountability plan before handing it off to the Judiciary Committee. In furtherance of this plan, just this morning, they noticed a full committee hearing entitled, quote, Open Borders, Closed Case, Secretary Mayorkas' Dereliction of Duty on the Border Crisis, close quote. Not to be outdone, Chairman Jordan raced to announce this hearing to ensure that we beat the Homeland Security Committee by a few days. But this is not a serious process. As Ranking Member Jayapal noted, we have still not had a single government witness come before the committee on the issue of immigration. Instead, my Republican colleagues continue to hide behind the use of transcribed interviews to talk to agency officials, seemingly afraid to have public hearings. And despite all the evidence to the contrary, we are still hearing the same claims that we heard at our first immigration hearing this year, that the southern border is open, that President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas opened it deliberately, and that it is mostly migrants who are smuggling drugs across our southern border. Yet, as my colleagues and I have discussed for months, none of these statements are true. Far from having an open border, the Biden administration used Title 42 to expel migrants with no due process for significantly longer than many of my colleagues on the committee felt was appropriate. The administration also has recently enacted a new asylum regulation that we are concerned limits access to asylum. That regulation even earned the administration rare praise from Chairman Jordan. These are not the policies of an open border. They are the opposite. But my Republican colleagues are not ones to let facts get in the way of their Fox News talking points. Certainly not the fact that encounters on the border have plummeted by 70% in recent weeks, thanks to new policies put in place. There is a lot that the Biden administration is doing on immigration that I support. For example, the use of parole, expansion of legal pathways, revamping of the refugee program, and opening up new regional processing centers in the hemisphere are all positive steps to repairing our broken immigration system. And there are some policies I do not like, but that is the point. We have policy disagreements. But you do not impeach a cabinet secretary because you do not like his policies. You work to pass legislation. You conduct oversight. You try to work in a constructive manner to convince your colleagues that you have the better argument. We need to work in a bipartisan way to fix our immigration system, not pass messaging bills that have no chance of being enacted into law, and embark on a purely political impeachment process. I would note that we now know for certain that the Republicans' extreme, cruel, and unworkable border bill cannot pass the Senate. As part of the time agreement to ensure that we did not default for the first time in history, Senate Republicans demanded a vote on H.R. 2, the Republicans' border bill. The bill got 46 yes votes and 51 no votes, encountering bipartisan opposition. That bill is a non-starter. Are my colleagues on the other side ready to sit down and discuss how we move forward with bipartisan immigration legislation? As I noted in our first hearing, Judiciary Committee Democrats stand ready to work on meaningful solutions to serious problems. Unfortunately, instead, it appears that the next sideshow is beginning today. And make no mistake, as the ranking member noted, it is clear that Chairman Jordan and members of the committee have already made up their minds. Instead of serious solutions to solve complex problems, we will simply engage in more political theater. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I could just put my Democratic colleagues at ease. Administration witnesses could be called by the committee Democrats. To date, they have chosen not to do so. I believe Mr. Mayorkas is scheduled to appear before the full committee in late July, but it is a very, very big leap from merely asking why our laws are not being enforced to advocating something like impeachment. I would remind my friends that they are not our teachers. I, for one, would not seek to invent grounds for impeachment, as the majority, or the former majority did in several proceedings. We are here to ask a very simple question: why are our laws not being enforced? And today, now I'll introduce today's witnesses. The Honorable Chad Wolf is the Executive Director and Chief Strategy Officer at America First Policy Institute. He's also Chair of the Center for Homeland Security and Immigration at AFPI. Secretary Wolf was the Acting Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. He's also a veteran of both Capitol Hill and the private sector. Secretary Wolf is a recipient of the U.S. Secretary of Transportation 9/11 Medal, the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security Distinguished Service Medal, and the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal. Mr. Joseph Edlow is the founder of the Edlow Group, a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation and a former acting director of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Prior to that, he served as the USCIS Chief Counsel and a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Policy at the Department of Justice. He's a veteran of Capitol Hill, serving as counsel on this subcommittee and counsel to Congressman Raul Labrador. He began his immigration-related career as a trial attorney in the Baltimore Immigration Court. Mr. Edlow is a JD from the Case Western Reserve University School of Law and completed his undergraduate degree at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts. Mr. Stephen Bradbury is a distinguished fellow at the Heritage Foundation and was the general counsel of the U.S. Department of Transportation from November 2017 until January 2021, where he oversaw all of DOT's rulemaking and enforcement actions. He is also acting Deputy Secretary of Transportation and briefly served as the acting Secretary of Transportation. He was the Principal Deputy and Acting Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel of the U.S. Department of Justice during the George W. Bush administration. Mr. Bradbury is a veteran of private practice and served as a clerk on the Supreme Court of the United States, as well as on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. He earned a J.D. at Michigan Law School and a B.A. from Stanford University. Finally, Mr. Aaron Reichlin Melnick is currently the Policy Director at the American Immigration Council, where he has also served as Policy Counsel and a staff attorney. Prior to that, he was a Justice Fellow on the Immigrant Justice Corps and the Legal Aid Society in New York. He earned a J.D. from Georgetown University Law Center and a B.A. from Brandeis University. I'd like to welcome all of our witnesses today, thank them for appearing here, and we'll begin by swearing you in. Would you please rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record reflect the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please be seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered in the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we'd ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes, and Mr. Wolf will begin with you.
Well, Chairman McClintock, Ranking Member Jayapal, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Today's hearing is titled The Border Crisis: Is the Law Being Faithfully Executed? Unfortunately, the answer by any objective measure or metric is a resounding no. I understand the difficulty and the complexity of running the Department of Homeland Security, so I do not say this lightly. The U.S. Constitution requires the administration to, quote, take care that the immigration and border security laws be faithfully executed, end quote. It's clear to me and to millions of Americans that the Biden administration has failed to do so. Today's border security system is unrecognizable from the America First policies of the Trump administration or even what was in place during the administrations of President Clinton, Bush, or Obama. In all candor, the Biden administration is the first administration of either political party to deliberately take steps to diminish the security along our southern border. Therefore, it is my opinion that new leadership is needed at the department. In contrast, under President Trump's leadership, the department established the most secure southern border in my lifetime by building the most advanced border wall system, reaching historic diplomatic agreements with nations, and putting in place across-the-board policies that deterred illegal immigration, disrupted the Mexican cartels, disincentivized the deadly flow of fentanyl, and enforced the laws enacted by Congress. I think the results are clear. During the Trump administration, fraudulent asylum claims declined. Those who qualified for humanitarian relief faster. Lives were saved as migrants stopped taking that dangerous journey north when they realized they would not be allowed and released into American communities. In stark contrast, today we see a border not only in chaos but in crisis because the Biden administration has dismantled all of the proven policies. Recommendations and concerns by career Border Patrol experts were ignored, and political correctness and rank ideology supplemented common sense and adherence to our immigration laws. To be clear, these laws did not change between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, just the decision by this one not to follow those laws. They have embraced destructive and unlawful policies that have made American communities dangerous and have enriched the Mexican drug cartels. Here are but a few examples. Nationwide catch and release. The Biden administration has intentionally decided to ignore its legal mandate to detain illegal aliens or to make them wait in Mexico throughout their immigration court proceedings. And a federal district judge has struck down this practice. DHS was then unable to process the volume of illegal aliens fast enough under this catch and release scheme, so it resorted to issuing notices to report. These are essentially an honored system document that asks illegal aliens to self-report to a local ICE office when they reach their final destination. Again, the courts have blocked the implementation of this practice. Next, a de facto amnesty. On day one, the Biden administration issued a 100-day deportation freeze on all illegal aliens, including those with criminal convictions. Let me say that again, including those with criminal convictions. Again, a federal judge has blocked the nullification of this interior enforcement. Another de facto amnesty of this administration is when the DHS Secretary's enforcement priorities exempt 99% of illegal aliens from the threat of deportation, including the declaration that being here unlawfully is no longer grounds for removal. But perhaps the most egregious example of violating the law is the unlawful use of parole authority. The INA could not be clearer that parole is a remarkably narrow authority and only allowable on a case-by-case basis. The numerous unlawful categorical parole programs that the department has implemented are not new, safe, or legal pathways, but a diversion of illegal aliens between ports of entry to ports of entry. It is very clear that the current administration is lying to the American people about the severity of the problem. So here's the reality. Large-scale catch-and-release policy has resulted in more than 4.5 million illegal aliens, including 1.5 million gotaways being allowed into American communities. That is a population larger than every major U.S. city except for New York City. There have been more than 200 known or suspected terrorists apprehended at the southern border in the last 2 years, compared to just 11 during the 4 years of the Trump administration. The border is effectively controlled by the Mexican cartels who crave these open border policies to further their business model. And more migrants have been found dead in the desert or have drowned in the river during the journey than ever before. And according to the New York Times, the Biden administration has lost contact with more than 85,000 children after releasing them to sponsors here in the U.S. These are the results of a process that the administration calls safe, orderly, and humane. But to whom exactly? Not to the migrants being abused, extorted, or dying along the journey. Not to the American communities that have been overrun, and not to Border Patrol officers who have been assaulted. Instead, the process that has been created over the last 2 years can be more accurately described as dangerous, corrupt, and inhumane. These policies are unlawful, and this is a crisis by design. Thank you. Look forward to the questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Next is Mr. Recklin Melnick.
Chairman McClintock, Ranking Member Jayapal, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Aaron Reichlin Melnick, and I am Policy Director at the American Immigration Council, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the belief that immigrants are part of our national fabric and to ensuring that the United States provides a fair process for all immigrants, including those seeking protection. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here today to help provide some perspective on the complicated reality of the application of immigration law at the border. At the Council, we have long brought attention through research, advocacy, and litigation to ways in which the executive branch carries out immigration enforcement. We are intimately familiar with the complex legal and practical considerations involved in the processing of migrants and have brought successful litigation against both Democratic and Republican administrations to ensure that DHS is following the law. The Constitution charges the president with faithfully executing the laws. Unfortunately for the president, Congress often passes laws which impose competing legal requirements on the executive branch. And some laws are easier to execute than others, especially in a world of limited resources. These challenges are readily apparent for immigration enforcement. As Justice Kavanaugh noted at oral arguments in Texas v. U.S. last November, there are never enough resources to detain every person who should be detained, arrest every person who should be arrested, or prosecute every person who's violated the law. Because of this hard reality, immigration officials have always been imbued with broad legal authority and with broad discretion in carrying out immigration enforcement. None other than Justice Scalia said in 1999 that at each stage of the removal process, the executive has discretion to abandon the endeavor. At the border, these countervailing concerns are critical. CBP officers are charged with simultaneously carrying out enforcement laws and humanitarian laws such as asylum. And not every person can be treated the same. There is no one-size-fits-all legal process for migrants. For example, the options available for processing a single adult arriving from Mexico arriving alone are different than those available for processing an asylum seeker from Cuba arriving with a baby. Some people can be rapidly issued an order of removal and deported. Others may require a full asylum screening, which takes time and resources. And beyond the law, congressional appropriations are finite, so there are logistical limits that are just as important as legal mandates. The use of detention is a perfect example of this. Despite laws which on their face seemingly mandate detention, Congress has never provided sufficient resources to detain every person who might be subject to mandatory detention. As a result, if there are 10 people who the law says should be detained, and only 5 ICE detention beds available, CBP must, by necessity, release the other 5. Thus, immigration officials under Republican and Democratic administrations alike have released some migrants, because while a single law might suggest they be detained, the laws in total provide alternate options. These limitations apply to all administrations. For example, data produced by the Department of Homeland Security reveals that over 1.1 million migrants were released under the Trump administration in total, including over 500,000 released at the border by CBP. Like today, these releases do not represent a failure to execute the law. Rather, they are a natural and lawful byproduct of competing legal and logistical considerations that all law enforcement agencies grapple with. Faced with a growing global displacement crisis, the Biden administration has undoubtedly struggled to manage with the resources they have. But this struggle is not unique to the Biden administration, nor is it a sign of an administration undermining the law. Instead, it is a result of outdated laws and a funding model that is badly out of balance. There are 2 million cases in the immigration court backlog, yet today we spend $8 on immigration enforcement for every $1 we spend on immigration adjudication. The last administration spent $15 billion on border wall. That's enough to pay for 17.5 years of the current immigration court budget. So it's not a surprise then that the system is not functioning as designed, and that it takes years for the government to determine who qualifies for asylum and who does not. Moving forward, I urge Congress to undertake the difficult challenge of updating our immigration laws and providing enough resources to our adjudication systems to ensure that chaos at the border becomes a thing of the past. But Congress cannot tell the executive branch to do 3 things: give them enough money to do none of them adequately, and then blame the executive if it doesn't like the result. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Next is Mr. Edlow.
Thank you, Chairman McClintock, Ranking Member Jayapal, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to present testimony regarding the ongoing crisis threatening the integrity of our immigration system. As this committee explores the underlying causes of the crisis, the question posed today can be answered only with a resounding no. The Biden administration has seen fit to ignore the law, instead favoring poorly conceived and poorly executed policy decisions. Their actions through executive orders, departmental memos, and rules upend the INA and congressional intent, have eroded our immigration system and propelled the crisis to current levels. Section 102 of the INA charges the Secretary of Homeland Security with administration and enforcement of the Act, and further vests in the Secretary the power and duty to control and guard the boundaries and borders of the United States against the illegal entry of aliens. The massive number of encounters recorded by CBP, the small number of alien removals by ICE, and the ever-increasing USCIS backlog, however, suggest that this Secretary has failed to faithfully execute the laws entrusted to him. The sharp rise in unlawful entries and attempts along the southwest border provide a critical litmus test of the crisis's scope, but it's an outgrowth of the departmental actions. Additionally, media often focuses on the border to the detriment of the other actions in inaction by ICE and USCIS, which we also must focus on. Since day one of the administration, the department has taken aggressive action to undermine immigration enforcement. Nowhere is that clearer than Secretary Mayorkas' September 30th, 2021 memorandum, which outlined the appropriate instances in which DHS was authorized to take action against aliens either unlawfully present or lawfully present but removable. Secretary Mayorkas outlined three main buckets for removal: threats to national security, threats to public safety, threats to border security. While in theory, this would seem to encompass many aliens, in reality, the numerous carve-outs, loose definitions, and required factors for consideration made it nearly impossible for ICE to move forward with most enforcement actions. These poorly defined categories gave even some of the most serious of criminal aliens a free pass in the interest of equity. This and other memos sought to redefine immigration enforcement by creating fictional priorities with no basis in law. Categorical prosecutorial discretion is not discretion at all. The department's failure to enforce the full INA in the name of prioritization and discretion is a dereliction of duty. So too, the department's regulatory agenda seeks to upend the credible fear process in the name of orderly processing. Starting with the presumption that every economic migrant is entitled to protection, in 2022, DHS issued an interim final rule on credible fear screening. Under the new process, a positive credible fear determination by an asylum officer will lead to a non-adversarial asylum interview before another DHS asylum officer. This impermissibly changes the process and undermines congressional action by shifting adjudication authority from DOJ to DHS. Even more concerning, written summary of the original credible fear interview doubles as an alien's asylum application, rendering the requirement that an alien file one moot. This shifts the burden and also provides a path for fraud and renders anti-asylum fraud measures moot. A second final rule issued last month appears to be tough on illegal border crossers, making them ineligible for asylum. However, the number of exceptions and the easily rebuttable presumption belie its stated purpose. This rule will have the opposite effect, as it will ultimately incentivize aliens to make the dangerous trek northward with families in tow. I would be remiss to not mention parole abuse. Regardless of the plain language of the statute limiting parole to case-by-case matters, parole has become a favorite tool of this administration. While first used as an alternative to detention, parole programs have subsequently played a large role in artificially decreasing border numbers. The expanded categorical parole programs that we're seeing now are wholly unlawful. Lastly, vast number of pending matters presently before USCIS will only increase if border prioritization for adjudicators is not stopped. While the agency claims to want to reduce this number, actions speak louder than words. It was recently reported that USCIS adjudicators were being shifted from their assigned work in order to support operations along the southwest border. The Biden administration has taken many measures in the past 2.5 years aimed at addressing the border crisis. However, it appears that no one thought to simply enforce the law as it is written. Instead, the department has, through its own actions, created the worst border crisis in American history. A return to the rule of law is the only cure at this point, and it is incumbent upon Congress to use its oversight and lawmaking authority to repair the damage done by the department. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you for your testimony. Finally, Mr. Bradbury.
Thank you. Chairman McClintock, Ranking Member Jayapal, Mr. Nadler, and distinguished members of the committee. Far from faithfully carrying out its enforcement duties, the Biden administration, with Secretary Mayorkas at the point, is flagrantly violating numerous provisions of our immigration laws, laws critical to the safety and security of the American people. Here are some specific examples of the Secretary's violations of law. The use of parole to release tens of thousands of inadmissible aliens en masse into the U.S. each month violates INA Section 212's express restrictions on parole, and it unlawfully circumvents the established procedures for refugee admissions under Section 207. Further, because of lax vetting at our ports and an overstretched border force, there's no way to know how many of the millions allowed into the U.S., let alone the huge volume of gotaways who have evaded our border patrol, fall within the categories of dangerous aliens prohibited entry under Section 212. Secretary Mayorkas has also ignored the mandatory detention and removal requirements of INA Section 235 and his directions to ICE not to take enforcement action against most deportable aliens defies Section 237. Under his watch, deportations have fallen to historic lows, while illegal immigration is at a record high. In recent months, DHS has shifted to a new process, equally unlawful, of pre-registering aliens outside the U.S. for fast-track entry and release using the CBP-1 mobile app. This CBP-1 escort service is a shell game. It's a device for funneling the flow of illegal immigration through our ports of entry instead of between them. Meanwhile, unlawful entry overall remains unabated. The claim that illegal border crossings have fallen 70% is a manipulated, distorted figure. It's a comparison to the highest week in the history of our country for illegal crossings, the week before the Title 41 program ended, when 10,000 illegals were encountered at the border. That's the comparison that gets to the 70% figure. It's false. In sum, the Secretary is asserting power to overturn the laws Congress has enacted and replace them with new immigration pathways, as he calls them, of his own design. Entirely new visa-like pipelines through which is streaming into our country an ever-rising flood of illegal immigration. This is a vast usurpation of law and of congressional power by the executive. These policies cannot be justified as an exercise of enforcement discretion. Secretary Mayorkas' own actions have caused the crisis, and he's refused to employ the full scope of resources available to him, shuttering detention facilities, ending cooperation with border states, and abandoning the Remain in Mexico program. Not to be overlooked, he has also flouted his statutory duty as secretary to protect the most vulnerable of migrant children from the scourge of human trafficking and abuse. Together, these violations of law have produced a colossal humanitarian disaster and a catastrophe for America. The victims include a sea of vulnerable migrants caught up in the horrendous grip of the cartels, the exploited children who are enslaved and abused within our own neighborhoods, and the everyday Americans across our land whose communities are ravaged by violence and crime, strained to the breaking point by unforeseen economic burdens, and infested with fentanyl. It's a grim picture for sure, but one the American people must see. We should all be grateful to you, Mr. Chairman, for shining a bright light on these violations of law. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now proceed to questions from the members, and we'll begin under the 5-minute rule with Mr. Biggs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to go fast because I think there's just so much that Secretary Mayorkas is responsible for and culpable for. So I'll start with you, Mr. Bradbury. At the direction of Secretary Mayorkas, DHS has released and continues to release tens of thousands of aliens every month into the U.S. through mass parole and now categorical parole. Is this a violation of law?
Yes, it violates INA Section 212 D5A.
Secretary Mayorkas is also mass paroling aliens he himself characterizes as refugees or asylum seekers without demonstrating that there are compelling reasons requiring that that particular alien may be admitted by parole rather than going through the USRAP process for refugee admissions. Is that a violation of law?
Yes.
What law?
It's a violation of INA Section 212 D5B.
Because he's not conducting adequate individualized vetting of the huge volume of mass-released aliens, there's simply no way of knowing how many of the millions of aliens Mayorkas has released into the U.S. fall into these categories of dangerous aliens. Is that a violation of law?
Yes, of Section 212A.
Secretary Mayorkas has instituted, as you've talked about, and all of you have mentioned, is the CBP-1 pre-registration, trying to funnel these illegal migrants to the U.S. ports of entry along our southern border. Is that a violation of law?
Yes, of 212, of 235, and I would say of 207.
All right. So what's happened here, of course, is that just in this past week, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit halted 2 DHS efforts to release massive numbers of illegal migrants into the U.S. on parole. So this is what one of the judges said, this opinion right here, that what his violations of the law, Secretary Mayorkas' violations of the law, are, quote, akin to posting a flashing "come in, we're open" sign on the southern border. The unprecedented surge of aliens that are started arriving at the southwest border almost immediately after President Biden took office, and that has continued unabated over the past 2 years, was a predictable consequence of these actions. Indeed, former Border Patrol Chief Raul Ortiz credibly testified based on his experience that there have been increases in migration when there are no consequences, and migrant populations believe they will be released into the country, close quote. And I won't go into the additional case as well, but I'm going to ask Mr. Wolf this question. We've established that Secretary Mayorkas is engaged in conduct violates his oath of office and the law. My question for you is, do you believe Secretary Mayorkas is violating the law intentionally, willfully, or is it just some oversight on his part?
So I'm going to have to guess. I think it's all of the above. I think they know exactly what they're doing, they being the department. This construct that they have put in place is not by happenstance or by chance, it's by design. And I think it's been very clear over the last 2 years. So everything that's going on at the border and the crisis that we see unfolding there was completely predictable. And we had talked about to the incoming administration about some of the challenges that we had in the Trump administration and warned them that if they did half of what was campaigned on during 2020, that they would see a crisis at the border. And so presumably they knew that, presumably they heard that,
So
yet it still went forward.
The Secretary and the new administration heard that. Incoming Secretary, right?
Numerous briefings, again, mainly with transition staff.
Okay, Mr. Edlow, I wanted to ask you this question, and it's related to testimony we heard yesterday about what's going on the border and the impact on Border Patrol agents and morale, et cetera. What are you hearing about what's going on because of the arrangements of this secretary?
Sir, I've heard that morale is at an all-time low throughout Border Patrol and throughout other enforcement entities. You know, I've spoken to some people who have been at the border recently. They've seen that exact same thing, that people are just very unhappy. They don't know whether they should be doing the job or whether they are supposed to be ignoring the law. And a lot of it's being run by memos that are, or just oral guidance being passed on.
I want to ask you the same question that I asked, and this is with regard to Secretary Mayorkas, and that is, do you believe that what he's doing is intentional, willful, or is it just he's just an incompetent buffoon and can't learn his lessons?
I don't think he's incompetent, Congressman. You know, looking at the memos, looking at the departmental actions, the regulatory actions, this is all part and parcel of an intentional action.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think it's long past time for him to be impeached. Now I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Washington State, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Clearly, there is an agenda here, and it is about impeaching Secretary Mayorkas. I want to take a step back and just say that it is quite stunning to have some of the witnesses here today that have the audacity to come before this subcommittee and attack the current Homeland Security Secretary. Mr. Wolf, who was Chief of Staff to Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, was a key architect of the universally panned by majorities of Americans across the political spectrum, that very cruel and unlawful family separation that was perpetuated by the Trump administration. Further, according to a federal judge and the Government Accountability Office, Mr. Wolf served unlawfully as the acting Homeland Security Secretary. Mr. Edlow, as acting Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, helped to run that agency into the ground, to the point that it almost had to furlough over 13,000 USCIS employees. On his watch, USCIS also ignored the Supreme Court's decision in June of 2020, stating that the Trump administration's attempt to rescind DACA was unlawful, holding new DACA applications at processing facilities even after the Supreme Court mandate was formally entered. And these are the witnesses that the majority brings to this subcommittee to discuss if, quote, the laws are being faithfully executed. Forgive my skepticism, or more bluntly, give me a break. Mr. Reichlin-Melnick, let me turn to you. I want to discuss mandatory detention. As discussed in your testimony, Section 235B(1)(b) of the Immigration and Nationality Act states that if an officer determines an individual has credible fear of persecution, that person, quote, shall be detained for further consideration of the application for asylum. That makes it sound like asylum seekers must be detained. Can you explain why all asylum seekers are in fact not detained?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think the main reason is resource-based. But there's both resource and legal authorities, I should note. But the biggest issue here is resources. For example, if 50,000 asylum seekers show up at the border in any given month, and every one of them asks for protection, there are not 50,000 detention beds. Even in 2019, when detention was at its highest, there were 55,000 detention beds, and that year, 891,000 people were encountered by the Border Patrol. And if even half of those were seeking asylum, it would not have been physically possible to detain all of them, which is why, under the Trump administration, hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers were released straight to court without going through the credible fear process. So this is, at the end of the day, it is a resource issue, and I will also note it is a legal issue because there are always exceptions to mandatory detention because Congress, generally speaking, can't force the executive to enforce the law in certain circumstances where that is literally impossible.
Has any administration, Democratic, Republican, ever been able to detain every single individual as required by the section of the Immigration and Nationality Act?
No, and in fact, when Congress first passed that provision in 1996, there were actually fewer than 10,000 detention beds. And this is at a time when there were routinely 1.6 to 1.7 million Border Patrol apprehensions a year. So it was not possible when Congress passed the law. It's not been possible any time over the last 27 years, and it's still not possible today.
And it's correct, isn't it, that even at our highest levels of detention under the Trump administration, it was never close?
That's right. In 2019, the Trump administration maxed out detention beds at about 55,000 in August 2019. That month, there were more than 55,000 people who arrived, and we also have to note that the average time that a person spent in detention was over a month. So the average detention bed in ICE detention only turned over about 10.7 times a year. So there was a max capacity that they could hold, even at 55,000 beds, of less than 500,000, and that year about 900,000 people showed up. So that's why the Trump administration, in fact, released hundreds of thousands of people.
So that's a lot of numbers. Let me just ask you bluntly, many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle like to claim the Trump administration ended what they call catch and release and detained all asylum seekers or sent them back to Mexico. Let me just ask you again, is that accurate? And just a simple yes or no answer is fine. And if not, you've already given us some of the reasons, but is that accurate?
It's not accurate, and even in 2020, after Title 42 went into effect, several thousand people were released, according to data from DHS.
From your testimony, it appears there is a detailed chart which shows that the Trump administration released over 500,000 migrants at the border during his 4 years as president. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's directly from the border, and additional were held in ICE detention and then released.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. You know, there's a very, very old saying of wisdom, you reap what you sow. God help us what we have reaped. It all started with the sanctuary cities, and they were wonderful. Everybody loved them. They were, not everybody for God's sake, but you know, all these big city mayors and other folks thought, yeah, this is a great idea to have sanctuary cities. Not so much anymore. We don't even know what to do in our big cities. From Portland, Maine to San Francisco, California, the lack of leadership and having these sanctuary cities has now created huge problems that even Democrats will recognize. But what else? What else has it that we've reaped? Well, we've done catch and release all throughout our nation. And then the people who are listening here who are not in this room but are around literally the country, they know that around the country there are people being released. We're paying for transportation. We're paying for health care. We're paying for a great deal of things that we don't even take care of our own people in the United States of America well enough. And you know, Mr. Melnick, you said, you know, I respect you, but you said that that immigration is part of the fabric of the United States of America. It is legal immigration. I don't understand what is so difficult to understand about the difference of legal and illegal. Illegal means it's not true. And we talk about Mr. Mayorkas, and you could spend an hour and a half on his case, but you know what I remember? I remember asking him when he was under oath, and behind him it was almost like a green screen, one of these screens, and I said, is everything okay at the border? Is everything good? Do we have our borders intact? And he said, absolutely, Congressman. You looked at the pictures, you looked at the video, and you saw little kids being thrown over to try to get them into the United States so that these adults would also be able to make their way in. You saw huge lines, you saw disease, you heard about fentanyl coming into our country, which it has. What are we doing to our country, man? Seriously. Sit down and think about this. What are we doing to the United States of America? No more do we immediately expedite people back when you can. No more do we have remain in Mexico. We misuse asylum for things it was never meant to be used for. Asylum doesn't mean, gee, I don't like where I live and I don't make as much money as I would like and it's a little bit tough going. I feel bad for those people. I feel bad for most of the world. If that's going to be our standard, then let's open every border everywhere in the United States of America and accept every human being who doesn't like their country. If you really want to do it, if you think that's right. And we talked about impeaching Mayorkas. Well, you know what? He didn't tell the truth under the oath. He committed perjury. That alone really, truly means something. He should be impeached. You're supposed to tell the truth, or for God's sake, that you at least want to tell the truth. Try to tell the truth. No more Title 42. And we didn't do a damn thing to try to save it or change it or make it more applicable if it wasn't good the way that it was. What's happening to these children and babies, not only our families, not only our children that are dying of fentanyl, the kids that are being brought across and now are beholden to the drug cartel forever. And the drug cartels establishing facilities, establishing a presence in the United States of America. This is all true. Nobody's making this up. The statistics show it. We know we have millions upon millions upon millions. And what is it, 5 million plus? I mean, just some articles I'd like for the record. Influx of migrants in Massachusetts continues to overwhelm state resources. Boston.com, 1,500 miles from the southern border, immigration fights disrupt Michigan town. Portland overwhelmed by growing number of asylum seekers. And the newscentermaine.com. Chattanooga, Texas, overwhelmed by migrant surge from Texas. California decides unannounced illegal immigrant arrivals aren't so much fun, aren't so easy, and maybe it's not such a good idea to have sanctuary cities after all. Come on. Everybody. Let's really look at this in the eye and see what we've got here. We are out of control. Yes, we should review our immigration laws and we should make them better. And yes, we should do more work. And I wanted to ask Mr. Wolf a question. I'm going to ask it really quickly.
No,
I'm not.
Jim, this time is
Sorry.
just expired.
Man, I'm mad and I'm tired of it. How about that? That's how I'm going to end. Thank you, Mr.
Chair
Chairman.
recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on the ranking member's comment earlier and just note Not only did Mr. Wolf serve unlawfully as acting Homeland Security Secretary and as the chief architect of the unlawful family separation policy, which literally kidnapped children from their parents, he also unlawfully defied a congressional subpoena in September of 2020 and refused to testify before the House Homeland Security Committee. It is just shocking that my Republican colleagues who claim to believe so strongly in congressional oversight would invite a witness who has so brazenly violated the law and so flagrantly violates our authority. But Mr. Reichlin-Melnick, I want to turn to you to discuss the issue of parole. The use of parole has become a big topic among my Republican colleagues. Can you discuss the history of parole and its bipartisan use over the last 70-plus years? And where is the authority for the executive branch to use parole?
Parole has been part of the immigration law since 1952, so it has been around for decades. And for many years, especially prior to the passage of the Refugee Act, parole was the primary way by which the U.S. admitted refugees. So, for example, from 1962 to 1969, more than 690,000 people came to the United States under parole from Cuba through various different parole programs. Since then, Republican and Democratic administrations alike have used parole to allow people to come to the United States in various categories that fit the national interest. These have been nearly every presidential administration, including the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and even under the Trump administration, tens of thousands of people were admitted under various parole programs that were then extant when he took office.
Some have criticized the Biden administration for its use of parole, saying it's not being done on a case-by-case basis. Would you agree with that statement? And if not, why not?
I don't agree with that statement for the primary reason that I think they misunderstand what case-by-case means. A case-by-case adjudication just means taking every application on its own. It doesn't mean that you can only give it to a few people. And in fact, in 1996, when Congress passed IRA, which included the case-by-case requirement, the Congress actually rejected an amendment which would have made parole into a much more narrow program. And I think the best example of this is to sort of look at this as a metaphor. If I want to create a scholarship program, and I say, this scholarship program is open to every child whose parents earn less than $100,000 who can show compelling need for it. That is case by case, because each student has to individually show that they have a compelling need. Whereas if it just said, this program is open to every person who earns less than $100,000, that would be categorical. There would be no case by case involved.
So it appears that the administration is merely saying that certain categories of people are eligible to be considered for parole. Is that correct?
That's right, and I think very similarly, the wet foot, dry foot parole program that ran from 1995 to 2017, under which about 40,000 Cubans came in through the border, that was also a similar circumstance.
But they still undergo a case-by-case determination to see if parole is appropriate.
That's right, and every parole memo has required it to be case by case.
And both Republican and Democratic administrations have made use of categorical parole programs in the past?
Well, I wouldn't call them categorical, but I would say parole programs that were open to certain individuals, based on, for example, their nationality or their job.
Did the Trump administration use parole?
Yes, I think the most prominent one is the Military Families Parole in Place program, which operated under the Trump administration.
Now, the Trump administration continued the use of parole as part of the Cuban Family Reunification Parole Program. That sounds like a categorical program that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have complained about.
Yeah, and Cuba has in particular had multiple parole programs in use for their nationals over the last 20 years.
Is this parole program similar to other family reunification programs recently announced by the Biden administration for Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras?
My understanding per DHS's announcements last week is that the new parole programs will be virtually the same as the Cuban Family Reunification Parole Program.
And can you explain how those parole programs work? Who is eligible, and are these individuals still granted parole on a case-by-case basis as the law requires?
Yes, so the family reunification parole programs are open to individuals from certain countries who have family members who have pending immigrant visa applications already. So they've been approved for a visa, but they're just in a backlog. And so there, if those individuals are invited to apply for the program from the National Visa Center, then they have to submit an application, they have to go through a vetting process, and then it is in the exercise of discretion of the United States to determine whether or not to admit the person through this parole program.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Tiffany.
Mr. Reichlin-Melnick, so the expansion of parole is legal?
In my opinion, yes.
Mr. Wolf, it says you served unlawfully. You want to share with us whether you served this country unlawfully?
So I've spent 7.5 years at the Department of Homeland Security. I was there shortly after 9/11 when they stood it up. I was there all 4 years during the Trump administration. I've held 8 executive positions at the department, including an assistant secretary position, an undersecretary position confirmed by the U.S. Senate, a deputy chief of staff position, a chief of staff position, and an acting secretary position. So I've been to the border dozens and dozens and dozens of times. I've talked to the men and women of the Border Patrol, of ICE agents, USCIS personnel. And so my expertise in this, whether you want to call me an acting secretary, you want to call me a dog catcher, my expertise is what it is. And I was also very proudly part of an administration that actually secured the border, put policies in place to bring back the rule of law and to secure the border.
So we just heard that the Trump administration paroled people into this country. Did you parole over 1 million people into this country during the Trump years?
No, we did not.
Mr. Bradbury, I believe we have the largest human trafficking operation, perhaps in the history of the world, that is going on at this point. And do you think the American people are aware of the role of NGOs driving these, running the pipeline to our border?
No, and I think that role has been sort of surreptitiously concealed by the way the administration has handled this. But they are contracting with non-governmental organizations to transport illegal aliens from the border to every district in the country.
Do you think some people that donate to some of these sometimes faith-based organizations, NGOs, do you think they're aware that their money is being used as an accessory for human exploitation and trafficking?
I seriously doubt most people are aware. They should be.
Yeah, I would urge people that that contribute to faith-based organizations, you should ask them. In fact, I would say to you, Mr. Chairman, I think we should have the head of Catholic Charities come before this committee and explain what they're doing down on the border to facilitate this illegal immigration that's going on in this country. Great work has been done by many of these faith-based organizations, but I think the American people should fully understand what's going on there. Mr. Bradbury, recent Florida lawsuits against the Biden administration have shed considerable light on DHS, but also the Office of Refugee Resettlement and what they're doing. Can you briefly explain how the NGOs and OR are facilitating this unprecedented human trafficking, especially of migrant children?
Well, of course, under the Trafficking Victim Protection Reauthorization Act, there are special duties that the Secretary of Homeland Security has to ensure that migrant children who are brought into the country from, not from Mexico, but from other countries, are placed with guardians in a way through HHS that ensures that they're not abused. They don't become the victims of sex trafficking or forced labor. But unfortunately, we know that that's happening.
Are you familiar with the, yes, it is happening. Are you familiar with the, let's see here, the third presentment of the 21st statewide grand jury in Florida, where they talked about trafficking children?
I'm not, I'm sorry.
I'd like to enter this into the record, if we may, Mr. Chairman. Everyone should read this about the horrific human trafficking that's going on that the state of Florida has identified.
Without objection?
Have the court orders been followed by this administration when they've been told they need to follow the law, Mr. Wolf?
I think in several instances they have not.
So, Mr. Chairman, I would just close with this. We heard from the other side that these are just policy differences that we have between the two sides. Tell that to Erin Rockwall from Pewaukee, Wisconsin, who was here a couple months ago. Remember her? Remember her son took, I think it was like a Percocet pill, something like that, Mr. Chairman, died in his dorm room. Tell that to Kayla Hamilton's mother. She was just here in the last month, wasn't she, Mr. Chairman? Strangled to death. Autistic young woman by someone who was here illegally. Tell that to all the Angel families out there. I urge everyone here, a Democrat candidate for president just was at the border in the last couple days in Yuma, Arizona, and stood with farmers and said, this cannot go on. I urge Democrats who are of good faith across the United States of America to join us in supporting the Secure the Border Act. You can do that. It turns out there actually is a presidential candidate. You can follow it if this issue is important to you to secure the border. You do have a candidate that will help us do it.
Gentleman's time
Yield
has
back.
expired.
Mr.
Ranking
Chairman?
member has a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record two district court decisions and a decision from the U.S. Government Accountability Office stating that Mr. Wolf served unlawfully as acting Secretary of Homeland Security.
Well, you lived down to all of my expectations, my dear friend. Your ad hominem attacks have become quite common here, but
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, since you are,
if there is
thank
no
you.
objection,
Since you did reference my behavior, I would like to say that that was a unanimous consent request to enter into the record factual documents. This is
and
not a
without-
matter of
and-
opinion.
and
This
without-
was a matter of
yes,
fact.
and without objection,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
we will enter them into the record. Ms. Lofgren.
I think it looks to me that this hearing has been held to come up with some rationale for an impeachment of the secretary for doing his job. You know, if the Congress, it's never been the case that every single person who's entered the United States without inspection is incarcerated. It's never happened. And if that's what the Congress wants to do, they'll look in the mirror, because the estimate is it would cost $35.7 billion to do that, and the Trump administration requests $3.1 billion for detention. So, you know, we have the Immigration Nationality Act, which is a law, but the appropriations process, that yields a bill, that's also the law. And so if it's impossible to accomplish something, if Congress needs to address that itself. Getting back to the issue of parole, which I think is very interesting, that's been a part of the law for a very long time. And I was thinking about its use, and sometimes its use depends on what's happening in the world. And I remember when Saigon fell, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fled communism. They had been our allies in the war, and the bulk of them were admitted using parole authority. And it was case by case, but it was a class of people who were escaping from communism. Is that correct, Mr. Melnick?
That's right. I believe the ultimate total is about 360,000 Indochinese came following the fall of Vietnam.
And thinking back on other uses, and again, it's categories that you look at each case within a broad category, but we have tended, and I think appropriately so, to want to protect people who are fleeing from communism. And if you take a look at the Cuban family reunification parole program, those were people who had applications made for family members who were suffering under the yoke of communism. And one by one, there was a determination on whether they should be given advanced parole to escape from that communist regime and join mainly American spouses. Is that correct, Mr. Melnick?
That's right. Parole has often been, in fact, a response to Cuba because, of course, with Cuba, they do not accept deportations. So we have had very little option for when Cubans arrived at our borders but to parole them in, and we have created multiple parole programs under the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and prior administrations for Cubans in particular.
And we have individuals even today. We have totalitarian regimes in Central America, including, you know, communist regimes in El Salvador and in Venezuela. I mean, and people are fleeing from communist oppression. Now, not every person who is leaving, you know, that's the reason. So it has to be case by case. But you would agree with me that what's going on in Venezuela is a communist-like totalitarian regime, is it not?
In Venezuela and Nicaragua, both, which I believe is what you were referring to, are both countries as well that do not accept, generally speaking, the returns of their nationals. And 1 in 4 people have left Venezuela in the last decade.
And so if we were looking at it on a case-by-case basis at people who were fleeing those regimes, it would really be in keeping with the proud tradition of this country of helping people who are fleeing from communist oppression. Wouldn't that be correct?
I believe so, yes.
I just wanted to mention one other thing. You know, there was parole in place for certain military families, and as I recall, that was really stimulated by an American soldier who was killed in Afghanistan, and then his mother was going to be deported along with his wife. And people, especially in the veterans community, became outraged at that the mother of this soldier who died for our country would be removed, wouldn't even be able to visit the grave of her son. And I think every recent administration, including the Trump administration, has utilized the parole authority to take a look at the family members of American soldiers. So isn't that the case, that that's been the modern tradition?
That's right. Since 2010, the Military Family Parole in Place program has been in effect. 20,000 people, we believe, under the Trump administration were paroled in under that program, were granted parole in place under that program. And crucially, in 2020, in the National Defense Authorization Act, Congress said it was the sense of Congress that that program was valid and lawful.
My time is up. I yield back,
Time has
Mr.
expired.
Chairman.
Without objection, the chair would ask unanimous consent to include in the record the Homeland Security letter, August 17, 2020, refuting claims that Acting Secretary Wolf was acting or was appointed unlawfully and providing the legal justification for his appointment without objection. Chair now recognizes Mr. Roy for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. Mr. Reichlin Melnick, let me ask you a question. Is Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, is he a racist?
I can't comment on that.
Okay, what about Mark Kelly from Arizona?
Similarly, cannot comment on that.
Maggie Hassan,
Also
senator,
cannot comment.
New Hampshire? Okay, can't comment on their being a racist or not. How about Senator Raphael Warnock from Georgia?
Similarly, I'm not familiar.
Okay, how about Catherine Cortez Masto from Nevada?
Likewise, Mr. Roy.
Okay, can't comment on whether they're racist or not.
I don't have an opinion as to the matter.
Okay, because you called me a racist. And you called me a racist because I said that Title 42 should be enforced. Something, by the way, that this administration did to the tune of over 1 million people.
Believe it's about 2.5 million people, actually.
Right. So this administration is racist?
I believe this administration has made a number of failures on the racial justice front.
So the Biden administration is racist?
I can't comment as the administration in
Interesting.
general.
Good to know. Good to know that the Biden administration is racist and get that on the record. The fact is, people who want to enforce Title 42 believe that there was a reason that Title 42 was put in place, but they also recognize that Title 42 is in fact a Band-Aid on a very broken system where the laws were not being enforced otherwise. But to throw around words like racist, let me ask you a question. Is my friend Henry Cuellar, is he a racist?
I can't comment on that.
Right, because Henry Cuellar said the border community is very concerned about Title 42 being lifted. This message of lifting Title 4 is going straight to the criminal organizations. He stood up and said that Title 42 should be enforced. The administration stood up. The senators I just listed said that Title 42 should have stayed in place. Now, my personal view is that Title 42 wasn't the thing that needed to stay in place, that what ought to be in place is an actual border security that secures the border. Mr. Wolf, in your position at the head of the Department of Homeland Security, notwithstanding what my colleagues want to throw around with the ad hominem attacks, you were in fact charged with securing the homeland, right? That was actually your task,
Yes.
securing the homeland at the Department of Homeland Security?
That's correct.
Right. And did you do that?
Yes.
Right. And is the current administration securing the homeland?
No.
No. In any measure, in any way, shape, or form, is the current Secretary of Homeland Security carrying out his duty faithfully under the Constitution to secure the homeland of the United States?
He is not. As I've outlined in my written testimony and oral testimony, there's numerous instances where he is not faithfully executing the law as written.
I thank you, Secretary Wolf. What I would say is, if you go back to April of 2022, in a Judiciary Committee hearing, I read word for word the statutory definition of operational control under the Secure Fence Act. I read it sitting right over here. There was a chart And I put up the chart, I put up the text, and the text says operational control means the prevention of all unlawful entries into the United States, including entries by terrorists, other unlawful aliens, instruments of terrorism, narcotics, and other contraband. I asked Secretary Mayorkas, do you have operational control? And his response was, I do. And Congressman, I think the Secretary of Homeland Security would have said the same thing in 2020 and 2019. In March of 2023, however, in a Senate hearing, Secretary Mayorkas said, quote, with respect to the definition of operational control, I do not use the definition that appears in the Secure Fence Act. And the Secure Fence Act provides statutorily that operational control is defined as preventing all unlawful entries in the United States. By that definition, no administration has ever had operational control. Just 2 weeks prior, United States Border Patrol Chief Raul Ortiz answered, no, sir, when asked by Homeland Security Chairman Mark Green, does DHS have operational control of the entire southwest border? So the United States Border Patrol Chief Raul Ortiz says, we do not have operational control of the border. He answered straight up, truthfully, no, sir. Why was it that the Secretary of Homeland Security, when I asked him that question, he said, yes, we have operational control. He said, I do, to be more precise. But then in the Senate, he comes back and says, oh, but no, I'm sorry, if you use that definition, you know, the one in the statute, no one has ever had operational control. What is your response to that, and how would you characterize having operational control of the border, as you would say in the previous administration compared to current?
Well, I would certainly talk about my time in the Trump administration, and if I were to get asked that question, whether we had operational control, the answer was no, we did not. Neither was the border secure, and I think words matter here. Those are very definitive statements. I always talked about how we were making the border more secure, or it was the most secure in our lifetime. But to say that you have complete operational control, to say that the border is closed, to say that it is secure, you're hiding the ball from the American people. You're not being transparent. And it's for a purpose, I think you can only guess, a political purpose, but it also defies what the men and women of the Border Patrol and others are doing down there. When they see their political leadership make these sorts of statements, it's so bad it's hard to find words. They don't know what to think, because they are on the line. They are on that border every single day, watching the hundreds of thousands of individuals walk past them that they have to process. And they see that someone is saying that this border is secure. Or you see the 200 known or suspected terrorists that have come across this border in the last 2 years, but somehow that border is closed and secure. I don't understand it.
Yeah, kind of like accusing people of whipping migrants at the border. I yield back.
Time's up. Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Melnick, just the Secretary doing his job, Mr. Mayorkas. Before you answer that, let me just say that General Kelly, former Secretary of Homeland Security, heard him say a couple of times that border security does not end or begin at the border. And today, as you look at the world, it's pretty safe to say, post-COVID, economies around the world are devastated. The only real game in town is the United States. Our economy, world record low unemployment rate, shortage of workers, and even China, I must say, is struggling to get back on their feet economically. We have a worldwide refugee crisis. If you look at this chart behind me from the UN Refugee Agency, it shows the number of displaced people just in the Americas alone. You can see countries across the region struggling. It's not a US problem, it's a regional problem. Mexico's dealing with this problem. Canada's dealing with this problem. Guatemala is feeling the effects, and of course, Europe. Further south, Colombia. If you look at this chart, Colombia is really struggling. And I must say, refugees are braving that trip north. Perilous situation. I want to show you the picture of a little girl struggling to continue north through the Darien Gap. This little girl lost her mother, and another refugee going north is trying to help her survive. If refugees are willing to do this, you can imagine the challenges at home. Now, let me say Title 42. We all talk about Title 42. I have to remind folks here, Title 42, The party in charge in Congress today, House of Representatives, voted to end the COVID-19 pandemic, and by operation of law, they lifted Title 42. Let me repeat, party in charge voted to lift Title 42. And let me say, I agree with them. Title 42 should not be an immigration tool, but a health issue. The administration has taken steps to prepare for Title 42's lifting. I was at the border numerous times before Title 42 was lifted. I would ask those officers in green and blue, are you ready? And they would tell me, we're as ready as can be. And it wasn't just CBP, it was DHS, State Department, and the administration who did a pretty good job in anticipation of the lifting of Title 42. And in fact, if you look at the next chart, these are the numbers reported publicly by Border Patrol Chief Raul Ortiz. 50% drop in the encounters after 42 was lifted. Unexpected. It's not over, folks. The world is still suffering from major economic challenges, and these numbers may be temporary. But the fact of the matter is, we've got to focus on getting economies around the world back on their feet, and we also have to focus on the other issue, which is immigration reform. Whether you like it or not, America is a massive draw, a big draw for workers from around the world. 50% of our farm workers are undocumented. Every time one of those undocumented goes to a farm, to a ranch, they find a job. We are also part of the problem, meaning we must pass immigration reform. Otherwise, we'll continue to be in the same situation. Mr. Melnick, I asked you earlier, is the Secretary doing their job? We hear about operational control of the border. What does that mean?
Well, there's a colloquial definition of operational control, which I think is, and then there's a legal statutory definition under the Secure Fence Act of 2006. And as Mr. Wolf just noted, it's not anything that any administration has ever reached. And in fact, the way Congress wrote the statute, it is physically impossible for any administration to ever get operational control.
So when we ask, is there operational control at the border, the answer is there never has been operational control at the border.
Statutorily, no. There are obviously opinions that some people may have as to on their own views from a colloquial sense, but under the statutory definition, no administration has ever had it.
A political conclusion based on the times.
Again, I think it's the reality is that the job of DHS Secretary is extraordinarily complicated and difficult, especially today with more people arriving from countries further away. As you noted with Colombia and other migrants coming, under the Trump administration, 3 out of every 4 migrants arriving came from 4 countries: Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. Today, in fiscal year 2023, less than half came from those countries. And that is a hugely difficult challenge for any presidential administration, regardless of party.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the witnesses being here today. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, a controlled border is a compassionate border. We had Sheriff Daniels actually testify here in this committee, and he said in 4 decades, Mr. Wolf, that he had never seen the border as secure as it was in 2018 and never as broken as it is now. So tell me in just a few months, 24, 25 months, what changed dramatically, and what do you think the reason we're having such an influx of encounters and others across the board?
Well, I think the easy answer, Congressman, is everything. Everything changed. And it started really from day one of this administration, where they had a very successful border security regime in place that we had perfected over 4 years. We didn't get everything right the first time, but over 4 years, we put a regime in place that held individuals accountable for illegally breaking the law, that got those who needed those asylum protections under U.S. law, we got them those protections quicker than they have ever gotten before. This administration, for a variety of different reasons, said, nope, we don't like it. So what did they do? They stopped border wall construction, which I should just mention, when you talk about operational control, that's actually in the Secure Fence Act. So Congress, back in 2006, thought that you would gain operational control by putting physical infrastructure along the border. But nevertheless, You would also, they tore down MPP, or the Remain in Mexico program, our asylum cooperative agreements, and the list goes on and on and on. And so it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what happens when you tear down those programs. And you had the former chief of the Border Patrol telling the administration at the time, this is what's going to happen when you tear down these programs and you don't put other deterrent immigration, border security programs in place.
So the
this is
experts
what's going to happen.
They gave them a heads up. They said, this is what's going to happen if you undo the policies in place.
I think numerous individuals did, yes.
You know, I say if you've got a water leak, you don't turn the pressure on to the house. And it seems like in a lot of ways we had some problems with immigration, and we have turned a tremendous amount of pressure on our border agents. And really now they're concierge. They're not really I mean, they're there, but they're just processing people through, and they can't keep up. Mr. Bradbury, I've heard that people south of the border are paying the cartel from, you know, 4,000 to 5,000, 6,000 just south of the border. Syrians were 20,000. Russians were paying 19,000, and I think Chinese nationals were paying $80,000. But the administration, in my opinion, has basically created twofold for people coming across the border. That's why I say it's compassionate to have it controlled, because you're either a drug mule, you're trafficking heroin, cocaine, or fentanyl, you're wearing carpet shoes. That's how you pay your passage into this country, or you become an indentured servant and you make installment payments. Have you heard that as well?
Yes, from some of the experts on immigration in the Heritage Center for Border Security. And what I understand is the cartels really effectively control our border at this point. Certainly everything up to the border.
So the operational control is actually the cartel has operational control. It's not us.
Yes, more likely that than our government. And they are making as much or more money off human trafficking now than the drug trafficking.
That's my understanding. And so, Mr. Edler, I got one question for you as well, sir. Considering this administration, do you think they're using the prosecutorial discretion correctly?
I do not. You know, my colleague up here talked about how Justice Scalia, in an opinion, talked about prosecutorial discretion and how that is something that is useful and that every prosecutor and every police agency has. That is true. However, it's done on a case-by-case basis. We're back to talking about case-by-case basis. A prosecutorial discretion done as a categorical prosecutorial discretion is not actual discretion. That's categorically saying we're not going to go after a group of people. That's not a case-by-case determination. When Justice Scalia was talking about it, he was talking about at any stage in the process for an individual, not for a group of people.
Mr. Meldy, does your organization plan on suing the Biden administration?
We have sued the Biden administration, as we've sued every administration going back 30 years.
Thank you, thank you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to inform the witnesses that I am the only member of Congress on this subcommittee that actually lives on the border. I represent El Paso, Texas. I'm a third-generation border resident. My children are fourth-generation border residents. I don't live hundreds of miles from the border. I live on the border, literally. And nobody wants an orderly immigration process more than those of us who have built our lives on the border. But I'll tell you one way we're not gonna get there. It's with performative hearings such as these. If we truly want to address our nation's immigration challenge and opportunity, we would do that through reasonable legislation, through compromise, and through comprehensive immigration reform. And I'd like to invite all of my colleagues on this subcommittee to look at a bipartisan immigration bill, the Dignity Act, that my colleague, Republican Maria Elvira Salazar, and I introduced. That would be a good way to begin talking about this. But instead, here we are engaging in what is my Republican colleague's first step in impeaching Secretary Mayorkas. Not because of any reason that they've laid out, but simply because this is Speaker McCarthy's gift to the extremists in his conference. Let's look realistically at the numbers. And Mr. Reichland-Melnick, thank you so much, because the American Immigration Council actually has produced this great chart. I've altered it a little bit, but what I'd like for the public, for the American public and our panelists to note is that actually numbers started increasing long before President Biden took office, long before the election even. And there was only one time when there was a precipitous drop in immigration, in apprehension, and that was right when COVID-19 hit. And that's when the border was shut down. But the chart that the American Immigration Council put together shows, and Mr. Reichland-Melnick, I believe you got these numbers directly from the Department of Homeland Security, and it demonstrates that not any of the deterrence measures that were put forth by the Trump administration actually deterred immigration. COVID did, but shortly after the border was reopened, those numbers started climbing right back up. That would tell us that we should be acting together in a bipartisan way on reasonable solutions. But instead, again, here we are focused on performance. Mr. Chair, I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record a ProPublica article about family separation.
Yes, without objection.
And I'd actually like to play the audio included in this article.
You're welcome to do with your time as you please.
Okay? All right, well, I'll play it from my phone.
Bueno, aquí tenemos una orquesta.
Mr. Wolf, do you recognize this audio?
I recall that audio, yes.
And you were working at DHS at the time that this audio was taken, is that correct?
I was at the department, yes.
This is audio from the horrific Trump administration policy of separating children from their parents at the border, a policy that has caused immeasurable trauma on children. And Mr. Wolf, was Ms. Nielsen, when she was the secretary and implemented this horrific policy, did the Republican Party attempt to impeach her?
So I would disagree with the premise of that question.
Yes or no?
It's
No.
not a policy.
So I will reclaim my time. No, the Republican Party never tried to impeach her, nor did they try to impeach you, despite the fact that you were an architect of this policy, despite the fact that you were in place when the insurrectionists took over our Capitol. You resigned because of the illegitimacy of the acting secretary role that you were playing on behalf of the Trump administration, yet no one tried to impeach
Lady's time's
you.
expired,
I
but
yield
since
back.
that was an ad hominem attack, I'll give Mr. Wolf.
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
So I think it's a useful conversation. So let's talk about children. Let's talk about protecting children. Let's talk about the 360,000 children that have come across this border.
Point of order, on
in the
whose
last
time is he
2 years.
speaking?
She made an attack on him.
Point of order, on whose time is Mr. Wolf speaking?
Ms. Escobar's time.
Ms. Escobar yielded back her time.
She made an ad
yielded back her
hominem
time.
attack on Mr. Wolf, and I thought it
Mr.
was
Chairman.
important to give
She
him an
yielded back her time.
opportunity
He
to
can speak on
respond.
someone else's
But the
time.
gentleman, I will recognize the gentleman's point well taken.
Thank you.
And proceed to Mr. Nels.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want everybody in this room to know, every member on this panel, this committee, to know that I'm the only one that has arrested an illegal alien that has been deported 6 previous times for killing one of my senior citizens when I was sheriff of Fort Bend County, Texas. I just want everybody to know that. All right. I have several different things I would like to discuss in my 5 minutes. Mr. Melnick, I'm paraphrasing some of your testimony. You said that in order to effectively execute our immigration laws, Congress must provide additional resources. Is that correct?
That's right, especially when it comes to adjudication with a 2 million case backlog. We are not funding the immigration courts enough.
Today, I believe, I'll paraphrase again, I'm here to talk about complicated reality of enforcing immigration laws at the border.
That's right.
What's complicated about 212F?
Well, 212F in particular is quite complicated because it cannot be applied at the border to turn away asylum seekers. The Trump administration tried that in fall of 2018. That was struck down by a court in California, upheld by the Ninth Circuit, and the Supreme Court declined to overturn that decision.
Well, we talk a lot about Title 42, and we talk about when Title 42 went away. It's my understanding, anybody on the panel can pipe in if you'd like, Title 42 dealt with the COVID, the pandemic, public health emergency. Is that right?
That's right. Title 42 was a CDC policy invoked in March of 2020 when the pandemic hit.
When I look at 212F, and I guess I'm just a simple man, when I look at 212F, it's been around since, I guess, 1956. It's been used many, many times, actually 1952. Every president since 1981 has used it at least once. Trump used it. They beat up on Trump when he did his little travel ban, but the Supreme Court upheld that and said he can do that, and he did. It's been used by Trump. He used it in the first week of office. Obama used it 19 times. Bush used it 6. Clinton used it 12. Bush before used it once. Reagan used it 5 times. And when you look at what that 212F is, and it seemed like, or 212F is, this is it. Everybody needs to take a look at it. Let me read it. Section 212F of the INA. Whenever the president finds that the entry of any aliens or any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, he may by proclamation, and for such period as he deem necessary, suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens as immigrants or non-immigrants, or impose on the entry of any aliens or restrictions that he may deem appropriate. It was used several times, 69 times in the past several years, dating back to 1980. Mr. Wolf, how do you feel about 212F? Are we not instead of providing all these resources and asking for more support, why can't we just say, let's get 212F? The Supreme Court has ruled that Trump used it when he had his travel ban. Let's just shut down the border, use 212F until we can get some operational control.
Well, Congressman, the Trump administration, particularly when we talked about the travel restrictions, used 212F effectively to make sure that we got more information sharing than we ever got from basically every other country around the world. Look, I think the conversation that I continue to hear is we need more resources and we need Congress to fix this crisis, and that is just not correct. This administration has all the authority and all the power that it needs to secure the border today. And I know that because we did it during the Trump administration. It wasn't perfect. I'm not saying that it was. But we did it effectively, and it became the most secure border in our lifetime. And so they can talk about more resources. You can talk about how it's difficult and how it's hard and how we don't have enough resources. That does not mean that you exempt whole classes of individuals from law or you categorically parole individuals into the country. If all of these individuals that they're paroling in really need asylum protections, why aren't they bringing them in as asylees or refugees?
Yeah.
They're bringing them in as parolees.
I've got 10 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Wolf. I will say this. Donald Trump has been the best president in my lifetime. And when he comes back in 2024, 212F needs to be used. We need to shut down our southern border until we have operational control and save America. Are you back?
I thank the chairman. I have a lot of friends in this room, and some are all are on one side and many are on the other side. But I've heard some shocking things in here that will literally take my breath away. Adding to the Canadian fires. Literally take my breath away. Someone offered up the Catholic Charities. And the Republicans are known to introduce legislation and try to pass legislation to penalize the Pope, Catholic Charities, and other nonprofits for simply doing what the scriptures in their faith tell them to do. In addition, the kind of self-righteous testimony that I've heard, and is not ad hominem of anybody, I've said it generically, is unbelievable. It is simply unbelievable. I've been on Homeland Security since 9/11, helped create the committee and the department. I could turn around and blame the victims who jumped out of the building. That's how outrageous this testimony has been. As it relates to Title 42, since it was lifted, the number of unlawful crossings at the southwest border has dropped nearly 65% per the Biden administration. The administration last 2 fiscal years, DHS has seized more fentanyl and arrested more criminals for committing crimes related to fentanyl and precursor chemicals than any previous 5 years combined. Fentanyl seizures are even higher in FY 2023. I really don't know what you're talking about. The administration has strategically placed more than 24,000 Border Patrol agents, officers, thousands of troops and contractors to the concern of many various positions, and over 1,000 asylum officers along the border. Let me be very clear. Chairman of this committee said, as it relates to the impeachment of the secretary, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Someone tell me how we're going to, in a bipartisan way, do the job that the American people want us to do. We are all concerned. But the misrepresentation of what Border Patrol agents are saying, I don't know what you all are hearing. When I go, they are both they're both collegiate, congenial, factual, compassionate, and reasonable. They love their job, and they believe that a lot of work is being done by Congress to give them resources, and someone just said they need no resources. And when there are issues that need to be addressed, we do need to address them in a bipartisan way, as opposed to condemnation. But for every visit you've been to the border, I've probably doubled it. And I've walked the streets and seen the despair. I've been in the nonprofits, and yes, I have seen the horrors of the Trump administration snatching children away from their parents and the complete disconnect that the children got in only months of separation when they tried to reunite them. And the children were looking in shock at the mother and would not even go to the parent. That's how dysfunctional they had become. I have a short time, Mr. Forgive me, Melnick. I know you have 3 names, but forgive me. Give me just a quick snippet of the fact that the world has changed with the amount of migration and people moving, i.e. Venezuela, and it is enormous. Just quickly, because I have another question quickly for you.
Yeah, this is the big difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration is who is coming. The Trump administration, it was mostly Mexicans and Central Americans. Now we are seeing far greater flows from other parts of the Western Hemisphere, in particular Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, which pose very different challenges to processing.
For those who say we're doing nothing, I know that the American Immigration Council has done some work on this. Can you discuss what you found as it relates to arrests by Customs and Border Protection of individuals trafficking fentanyl? And can you quickly distinguish, there is something called human smuggling, which is what the bulk of activity is going on with the cartels and the smugglers. It is different from human trafficking. I am a champion against human trafficking. Please explain the fentanyl issue that you've been able to determine and how smuggling and trafficking is different and how it is human smuggling that is going on at the border and that the administration has its hand on trafficking. Yes, sir.
Yeah, really
and let me say Reichlin Melner. Thank you.
Really quickly, smuggling is usually people pay a smuggler to smuggle themselves. Trafficking is people who are being trafficked involuntarily against their own will. And when it comes to fentanyl, I think there I look to what the law enforcement agencies say, CBP, ICE HSI, the DEA, and the FBI all say the overwhelming majority of hard drugs such as fentanyl come into the U.S. at ports of entry, smuggled usually in passenger cars and most often by U.S. citizens.
And they're catching them.
The fentanyl seizures have increased every year, and I believe the deployment of non-intrusive inspection technology increases year by year.
Gentlelady's time
Thank you.
Mr.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
We are a nation of laws, or we are not a nation at all. We already have laws in the books that can prevent the catastrophic border crisis that we are seeing every single day today, and we know they work. And do you know how we know they work? Because they worked under President Trump. And they worked because he and his administration and you, Mr. Wolf, chose to enforce those laws. Now, is this merely a failure to act, or is this intentional? President Biden and Mayorkas act as if their hands are tied, like nothing can be done to fix this border crisis. But interestingly enough, almost every policy this administration has attempted to implement has been roughly a failure. Biden's Afghan withdrawal, Biden's foreign policy, Biden's economic agenda, failures. Except for the border crisis. The border crisis is their only success, and I say that because they have successfully created a chaotic situation to carry out a radical agenda. Problem, reaction, solution. The administration created this problem, listened to the reaction, and I suspect they will present a solution. And that solution, ladies and gentlemen, in the future will be an attempt at mass amnesty. There, I said it. The real solution would have been to prevent this crisis from happening in the first place. And the Biden administration could have done just that if we'd have kept simple laws on the books and enforced the laws of this country. Simple as that. Do you know that over 200 people on the terrorist watch list have been arrested at the border since President Biden took office? That should be terrifying for you to hear. And that's just the ones that we know of. How many have escaped into the interior of the United States? Now, I served my country in combat, and I was actually a West Point cadet when 9/11 happened. And my classmates and I stood about 60 miles north, just up the Hudson River, New York City, and watched 3,000 innocent lives evaporate from our world in 90 minutes. And my fear is that with our porous border, another 9/11 is imminent, and it will happen because this administration won't fulfill its basic responsibility. It's to secure our homeland. The Biden administration is making a deliberate choice to not secure our border. And do you know how I know this is a fact? Because 3 years ago, we weren't having this conversation. My first question is for you, Mr. Wolf. What has changed between these administrations that has caused this crisis to explode to what we've seen lately?
I think it's the intentional destruction of a lot of effective policies that were put in place during the Trump administration. Happy to name those one by one. But we've heard a lot of talk about detention capability. And what I will say is, yes, it's difficult. It's hard to detain individuals. But if you actually want to remove individuals from this country, you need to detain them. And under the Biden administration, they have removed the lowest number of individuals in, I would say, decades. 39,000 removals of criminal illegal aliens. That is a drop of over 62% from FY20, which was during COVID. So there's a lot of different policies that they have decided to tear down, very effective policies, and they did that without any analysis. They did it because they didn't like it. They didn't like the president. They didn't like whoever at the time. Let's forget about whether they were actually protecting Americans, where they were protecting American communities. And I think lost in this whole discussion is what is best for Americans on our border security policy, our immigration policy. It's not what is best for illegal aliens. It's what is best for Americans. That should be our first duty. Yes, we need to make sure that those that are coming here seeking protections that qualify for our protections under law get those protections, absolutely. But we need to think about Americans first, and I think that's where this administration is falling short.
Another question for you, sir. If you were running the Department of Homeland Security right now the same way that Secretary Mayorkas is doing right now, what do you think President Trump would have done to your job?
I would no longer be there.
I kind of tend to agree with you on that, sir. And I want people to understand this. We've had over 6 million people, illegal aliens, enter our country since Biden's taken office. 6 million. We have conceded our border to the cartels. Fentanyl has killed enough fentanyl has poured into this country to kill every single American 5 times. We have sworn enemies on the terrorist watch list in the United States, and we don't even know where they are. If President Biden does not secure this border, we're going to have another 9/11. That's how serious this is, and we must do our job and protect the American citizens. Thank you all for being here, and God bless you.
Thank you. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to do a little reset here. To be very clear, President Biden inherited a disaster of a border from former President Trump. We all watched it on TV aghast. And he did it in the middle of a global pandemic. Now, the Biden administration is not perfect, and I'm not here to defend every single thing that they've done. But what they have done is work to correct course, to tighten security while also expanding pathways to legal immigration. These have been good faith attempts to enforce the law, which former President Trump rarely tried to do in a way that helped our immigration policy. It was the Trump administration that allowed unaccompanied children to cruelly be held in detention far longer than allowed by the law. It was his administration that designed and boasted about family separation. It was his administration that wasted resources illegally on inefficient enforcement mechanisms like the construction of the border wall. Countless reports have demonstrated how the militarization of border security increases the number of unauthorized immigrants who remain in the United States because it disrupts historically circular flowing migration and results in a net undocumented inflow. This hearing is yet another example of my Republican colleagues' preference for partisan political hearings over engaging in good faith discussions about solutions that could actually work. And there are bipartisan proposals for this on both the House and Senate side. Yet we've had 0 hearings on those. As we've heard, in the days after Title 42 ended, Border Patrol encounters have gone down. So it is particularly ironic that we are having this hearing now. Now is the time that we should be working together on solutions. We need legislation that enhances border security. Several of us recently visited the border, and we got lots of great suggestions about how to do that from the people who deal with this every single day. We also need legislation that expands pathways to legal residency and citizenship and strengthens our economy. You might have seen me step out briefly about a half an hour ago to meet with the home builders from North Carolina. One of their priorities for their legislative agenda is comprehensive immigration reform. Same priority for most of the businesses in my district in North Carolina. Same priority for the agricultural community. Same priority for the hospitality industry. Yet we haven't had one hearing on doing that. For 2 sessions of Congress, I've introduced bipartisan, bicameral legislation to help people who came to this country legally as dependents of visa holders. And because we have such a broken immigration system, they're being forced to self-deport and leave their families in the only country that they know because this Congress does not have the will to take that bill up. Now, to the credit of the last Congress, it passed the House in 2 different vehicles. We have a broken immigration system on many levels. It is time to get about the business of having hearings on real legislation that will solve real problems and help real people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Wolf, when you were acting DHS Secretary, the border was secure, was it not, for all intents and purposes?
We worked every day to secure it, every day, every week, every month.
And we had reached a very low number of illegal border crossings, had we not?
I think by a number of different metrics, and that's certainly one, the number of apprehensions fell.
And since then, of course, we have seen a mass migration of unprecedented proportions, millions and millions flooding into the country. Were there changes in law that occurred to account for this? Or is it entirely a matter of not enforcing the law?
There's been no changes in law that I'm aware of.
Mr. Edlaw, there have been a lot of instances now when the administration's been called out by the courts for failing to enforce the law. What's been the administration's response to these court orders?
Well, they've, with the exception of the September 30th memo, which was enjoined and vacated in June of 2022, to the extent that the administration has been able to get around the court orders, they have.
Has anybody challenged them on that in court? Have there been any?
Some states have filed, have challenged them, yes.
Has any court come back and issued a criminal contempt citation for failing
not
to?
That I'm aware.
Are there any pending?
I couldn't answer that, sir.
All right, Mr. Wolf, any thoughts on that? Mr. Bradbury?
I don't believe there are any pending. Obviously, Mr. Chairman, it's difficult for a court to impose contempt.
Right. Well, what I'm trying to do is determine the difference between simple maladministration and deliberate violation of law. I think that that's a very bright line that we need to define. We spoke of detention. I think Mr. Ricklin Melnick made a very good point. You've got 10 illegal aliens. You have beds to detain 5. What do you do with the other 5? Is that what's actually going on, Mr. Wolf?
So not only should you be detaining, but if you're not able to detain, then you can certainly have them wait, such as what we did under MPP. I think that's an interesting point that was missed in this whole debate, right? We started talking about detention and how that's never achievable. And I'm not here saying that you can detain everyone, but there is another option that Congress in the INA tells you to do. So if you can't do that, then you can hold them in a third country, as we did under the Migrant Protection Protocols. Again, interesting that that was not brought up. So there are other ways that you can enforce the law. This idea that if you can't detain them, that simply they're released into American communities is not the law. And we shouldn't pretend that it is, but yet that is what is occurring. It's what's been occurring for the last several years.
Is this actually a violation of law, or is it just a very poor decision?
I would say it's both.
Mr. Edlaw, I'm told that all of the capacity that we have right now isn't being used, and yet illegal aliens are being released into the country.
I don't believe it is being used, Congressman. I think, for the most part, there are more interest right now in, it was in paroling people in, now it's giving notices to appear at the border and letting people go along their way. There's not an interest in detaining as far as I can see.
Let's talk about parole authority. Congress did tighten the criteria for paroles back in the mid-1990s, precisely because it was being abused in the manner that Mr. Ricklin Melnick outlined. Is it true that 20,000 mass paroles were done under the Trump administration, Mr. Wolf?
So there are a number of parole programs that we administered, obviously, that we began or we continued to administer that was going on during the Obama administration and alike. But I think, again, the important point here is, are you trying to secure the border, and are you trying to hold people accountable, and are you trying to get them the protections they need? So as they parole people into the United States, there's no asylum protections for them. They're not in asylum proceedings. So if they truly need asylum, why aren't they being put into asylum proceedings? Instead, they're simply paroling them in to the country to, again, to have this status for a year, perhaps even 2 years at a time. It doesn't make any sense. It's a little smoke and mirrors of what the administration is trying to do at the border.
Okay. Asylum hearings are designed to be adversarial in nature. They're presided over by immigration judges bound by the law. How does that differ from the administration's replacement of this process with USCIS asylum officers? Mr. Bradbury?
Well, it's completely different now because they're reviewing their own appeals of their own decisions. It's not an adversarial process.
Is there a provision of law that gives them this authority?
No, it's in violation of Section 103 of the INA. It's the Attorney General and the immigration judges that have to hear those appeals.
Well, I see my time has expired, and I see Mr. Swalwell has arrived. So I recognize him for 5 minutes.
Why is this hearing happening within the same week that we just learned that the Department of Homeland Security announces the average daily unlawful border crossings are down sharply relative to the period before Title 42 ended? We're seeing record number of fentanyl being seized by Border Patrol, seized, not getting past them, but successes because our law enforcement are doing their job and showing up every day, and we don't congratulate them. Instead, we use that as a political tool to try and hit the Biden administration. Why is this hearing happening? It's because it's a part of a corrupt bargain, a dirty deal that allows Speaker McCarthy to stay in power. He's on an installment plan. He's got to pay an installment every week. He's got to give Tucker Carlson the January 6th sensitive police footage. He has to put Marjorie Taylor Greene on the Committee of Homeland Security, even though she said January 6th was a 1776 for our country, and she goes and visits the terrorists of January 6th at the DC jail and dishonors the police officers. Another installment is we have to defund the effort to help Ukraine, to satisfy the Putin bloc that is across the aisle. And this is an installment that Ms. Taylor Greene openly admitted when she said she's voting for the crazy idea that we'd pay America's bills to lift the debt ceiling because she's going to get some dessert out of it. That's what she said. She said, I'm going to get some dessert out of this shit sandwich. Those are her words. This is her dessert. We all have to sit here for her dessert.
The gentleman will suspend for a moment. The gentleman is warned not to use vulgarities in this committee room, and the gentleman is warned to restrain from making attacks on the motivations of members.
Mr.
The gentleman will proceed in order.
Chairman, I apologize for quoting your colleague.
Point of order.
No, Chairman, I apologize.
The gentlelady will state the point of order.
No, Chairman, I apologize for quoting your colleague. I won't quote her again.
You will
That's
not,
offensive to you.
you will refrain from questioning the motives of members.
So we're here because that was a promise that my colleague told the public was made, that we get to impeach Mayorkas. So this is the predicate to bring impeachment proceedings against the Secretary of Homeland Security, who just announced last week that daily unlawful border crossings are down sharply. Look, Kevin McCarthy may have the title of Speaker, but it's clear to me, because of this hearing today, he doesn't have the job. The job is by the person who's getting her dessert here today. I also think, Chairman, it's quite rich that the title of today's hearing is whether the law is being faithfully executed, because your principal witness was declared to have been an unlawful acting Secretary of Homeland Security, and on September 17, 2020, failed to honor his own subpoena, which puts him in good company because the chairman of our committee is 400 days into not honoring his own subpoena. But we're calling this hearing a question of whether the laws are being faithfully executed, with the witness who didn't honor a subpoena chaired by a committee chairman who did not honor his subpoena. Very rich. So my question, Mr. Reichlin-Mesnick, is considering that border crossings are down, we're trying our best with a party that doesn't want competence at the border. They want chaos. They want to declare there's open borders to try and incite people to come to the United States. Do you see grounds at all, any predicate that would summarize why an impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas would be justified?
Congressman, I'm not an expert on impeachment, but what I do know is that it's been 33 years since we last updated our legal immigration laws and 27 years since we last updated our asylum laws. We are operating a 20th century system, a system that in some cases came around before the World Wide Web. And it's not a surprise that in a 21st century global displacement crisis, the United States is struggling very hard to keep up. And so I think what this shows is that we need to fix and update our laws, give the system the resources it needs to work, and ensure that the DHS can actually carry out the laws in a way that today, in many ways, it struggles with.
Thank you. And I think the summary here is people want competence. They don't want chaos on immigration, on the debt ceiling, on anything else. I yield back.
Thank you. I think they also would like civility. This concludes today's hearing. I want to thank all of our witnesses for appearing before the committee. I want to apologize on behalf of the committee for the ad hominem attacks that were directed at several of our guests today. Without objections, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the records. I know I will have quite a few. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.